I will now call Tracy Gilbert to move the motion, and I will then call the Minister to respond. Tracy Gilbert.
I beg to move that this House has considered the matter of tackling demand for prostitution and sex trafficking. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Madam Chair. There is a group of people who don't get talked about enough in Parliament. In fact, they are rarely mentioned in public at all. We seldom hear from them directly and rarely knowingly encounter them, on our screens or in person. It's almost as if they are invisible. I suspect this is how they would like to remain, because if we heard what they said and saw what they did, I believe we would want to stop them. This group of people is men who pay for sex. Sex buyers rely on being unseen, while they ruin lives, leaving us as a society and the individual women left to pick up the pieces of the carnage they cause. The demand from men who pay for sex fuel a brutal prostitution and sex trafficking trade. It's funding predatory websites which make millions of pounds advertising women for sexual exploitation every day, and is causing untold trauma to some of society's most vulnerable women, whilst undermining equality for all women. Today is an opportunity to bring the demand for sex and sex trafficking out of the shadows and into the spotlight. Madam Chair, I want to start today by looking at the men who create this demand. To answer that, I'll start by reading their own words, written on a website where men anonymously rate and review women who they have paid for sex. They say, no smile, her atrocious English made her interactions even more impossible. I asked for OW, oral without a condom, which she reluctantly did. This was a very substandard service from someone who is not interested in providing customer satisfaction. She basically lay there, shut her eyes and let me get on with it. She made no noises. I put up with this for about 5 minutes of lying there like a side of beef before sitting up. Bad attitude, everything was off limits. Finally, I got her to lay there, but it was like shagging a dead fish. Madam Chair, I'm sure we can all agree that these are sickening remarks. Men who buy sex are reviewing women as if they are reviewing an Xbox game. These comments prove that men who pay for sex treat women as subordinate sex objects whose role it is to service their sexual desires. These comments are just a handful of approximately 28,000 reviews left on one single sex buyer's website. Where analysed by researchers Elisa Trankas, she found that the most misogynistic reviews were posted when women disrupted buyers' fantasies, like by failing to adequately pretend they wanted to have sex with these men. Negative reviews of women were used as a tool to control their behaviour, publicly punishing resistance while rewarding compliance with their sexual demands. Sex buyers may delude themselves into thinking that paying money absolves them of responsibility for subjecting vulnerable women to unwanted sex, but the opposite is true. It is not possible to commodify sexual consent. The money is coercion. As the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls states, and I quote, "Prostitution is intrinsically linked to different forms of violence against women and girls and constitutes a form of violence in and of itself." I will give way.
Edinburgh North for bringing this forward. It's a hard subject to speak about. It's incredibly hard to listen to. Not because the Honourable Lady is doing it, just the subject content is so graphic. I know the Honourable Member is aware of the Northern Ireland legislation, but does she agree there's a need to make profiting from the prostitution of others illegal with criminal repercussions? And just as an example, the 2015 Northern Ireland Human Trafficking and Exploitation Bill does this. So would the Honourable Lady join me in calling for specific UK-wide legislation to protect vulnerable men and women from the exploitative sex industry? I know the Minister's always keen to answer. She does well. Yeah.
Thank you, my honourable friend, for that intervention. I will come on to that later on, and yes, I do agree with the comments that you made. The most recent research into the scale of paying for sex found that 3.6% of men in the UK report having paid for sex in the previous 5 years. Men who are most likely to have paid for sex are single, aged between 25 to 34, in managerial or professional occupations, and those who have reported high numbers of sexual partners. Shockingly, but not surprisingly, it was revealed last month that multiple members of the Scottish Parliament have paid for sex. We can only predict that former members of this House have too. Demand is not inevitable, and the law plays a pivotal role in whether this minority of men choose to pay for sex. In one UK study, for instance, researchers asked over 1,200 sex buyers, would you change your behaviour if a law was introduced that made it a crime to pay for sex? Over half said they would definitely, probably or possibly change their behaviour. While sex buyers are driven by male sexual entitlement, ultimately they do it because they can. Because the law isn't just failing to stop these men, it's making it easy. Not as only is paying for sex legal in England, Wales and Scotland, so are the pimping websites advertising thousands of women each day for sex buyers to choose from.
On that point, will my honourable friend
I will.
Thank you, Chair, and I congratulate my honourable friend for bringing forward this debate today. Does my honourable friend agree with me that pimping websites are actually facilitating sex trafficking of women, making it easier for traffickers and organised crime groups to profit from the dehumanising violence, exploitation and trade of vulnerable women?
I do, and I thank the honourable friend for that intervention. These websites function as massive online brothels. They are the go-to place for traffickers to advertise their victims. I've said it before and I'll say it again today. Pimping websites are making it as easy to order a woman to sexually exploit as it is to order a takeaway. Madam Chair, I want to move on to talk about the women who face the devastating consequences of prostitution and sex trafficking for the rest of their lives. In a 2016 inquiry, the Home Affairs Select Committee found that a number of prostitutes were in a vulnerable position. Based on evidence from St Mungo, 1 in 4 women living in their housing services were current or former prostitutes. Their evidence also showed that of their residents who had experienced rough sleeping, 1 in 3 were currently or former prostitutes. In 2022, Beyond the Streets, a publication by Grace Collis and Dr Katie Thorbley, found that 78% of women actively seeking support to leave prostitution needed support with their mental health, 71% needed support with relationships with friends and family, which are often broken, and 63% needed support to access employment and education. And tragically, a database managed by National Ugly Mugs recorded 180 murders of prostitutes across the UK between 1990 and 2016. Evidence by Agenda to the Home Affairs Select Committee inquiry stated that women in prostitution were 18 times more likely to be murdered than the general women population. Behind these statistics are vulnerable women who all too often feel like there is no escape from the exploitation that they face. Fiona Broadfoot from told Sky News in 2018 that she was physically abused and exploited by her pimp from the age of 15. Fiona detailed how she was introduced into prostitution within 2 weeks of first meeting her pimp. She was arrested, her pimp was not. Her criminal convictions have followed her out of prostitution, resulting in employment and education opportunities being snatched from her. Operation Fasthold, which was a joint operation between Police Scotland and the Home Office, showed that women are trafficked into the UK to meet this demand. In that case, it was mainly women from East Asia, uprooted and coerced into prostitution, and afterwards finding themselves at the mercy of our asylum process, stuck in low-paid work or at the hands of another criminal gang. In Edinburgh, over this weekend, 142 women were being advertised for prostitution on one website alone. 5 of the top 10 adverts are explicitly posted by so-called agencies. So the site isn't even trying themselves to hide the organised nature of this exploitation. The devastation and exploitation of women continues, and something has to change. Madam Chair, The law must deter demand for prostitution and sex trafficking. It must reflect the reality that prostitution is violence against women by holding perpetrators and profiteers to account and, crucially, supporting victims. A growing number of countries and states have adopted this approach, outlawing paying for sex and profiteering from prostitution of others, while decriminalising victims of sexual exploitation and providing support and exiting services. These countries include France, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Sweden, Norway and Iceland. Their experiences show that demand for sex buyers and the trafficking of women to meet that demand can and must be deterred. It's why...
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for bringing this crucial debate to Westminster Hall today? I wonder if she has noticed the private members' bill that Ash Regan, the member of the Scottish Parliament, has brought, which looks to do exactly what you've described by decriminalising the selling of sex. And if she'd like to congratulate Ash Regan and wish her luck in her private members' bill.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I will come back to that later on in my speech. Sweden was the first country to criminalise paying for sex, while decriminalising victims of sexual exploitation. When it adopted the Sex Purchase Act in 1999, providing over 2 decades of evidence of its effectiveness. Since that pioneering act was introduced, demand has dropped significantly, public attitudes have transformed, and traffickers are being deterred. An analysis published by the European Commission concluded that the Sex Purchase Act, coupled with proactive policing, has, and I quote, created a less conducive context for trafficking. In Ireland, an evaluation by researchers at University College Dublin of the country's demand reduction legislation reported an increased willingness amongst women in prostitution to report crimes committed against them and in their improved relationship with the Gardaí overall. In France, there's a strong public support for the country's demand reduction laws. This is significant given the importance of changing public attitude and deterring sex buying. An Ipsos survey found that 78% of the French public support their legislation on prostitution, and 74% of people think prostitution is violence. Madam Chair, demand for prostitution and trafficking is not inevitable, and the law has a critical role to play in deterring it. And as my right honourable friend had just mentioned, I welcome the Prostitution and Offence Support Scotland Bill, which has been introduced to the Scottish Parliament by Ash Regan MSP, which looks to replicate the lessons learned from other European countries. I hope that all MSPs will consider the legislation carefully and support it as it makes its way through the Scottish Parliament. I'm keen to hear from the Minister whether the UK Government will be looking to bring forward similar legislation. I want to pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Gower, who chairs the all-party parliamentary group on commercial sexual exploitation and has tabled amendments to the Crime and Policing Bill to outlaw pimping and paying for sex and decriminalising victims of sexual exploitation by removing sanctions for soliciting. I'm proud to be amongst the more than 50 members of Parliament who have signed these amendments. The proposed reforms are backed by survivors and best practice frontline support services such as Tara in Scotland, Naya, Women at the Well and Kairos, who I recently had the opportunity to meet and hear from. These vital amendments will help the Government to meet our manifesto commitments of halving violence against women and girls by reducing the demand for prostitution. I urge Ministers to accept the amendments, and I'd be keen to hear from the Minister her views of which amendments may be accepted. I will.
She's making an excellent speech, and I congratulate her on bringing forward this debate, however short. We're all managing to squeeze little bits in. Does she agree with me that those who argue that by outlawing pimping websites we're just going to drive this all underground are absolutely wrong? And actually what you see is the reverse. You see more prosecution rates going up, so therefore the demand decreases. Does she agree?
I do agree, and I will touch on this if I have time later in my speech, and I thank her for the intervention. These vital amendments that are being brought forward will help the Government to meet our manifesto commitments, as I've earlier said. Before concluding, Madam Chair, I want to address some of the myths and misinformation surrounding the actions that I've proposed today, and that my right honourable friend has alluded to. One is that outlawing pimping websites would simply displace trafficking to the dark web, making no impact on the scale of sexual exploitation. This claim lacks both logic and evidence. Advertising victims of sex trafficking on the dark web carries multiple disadvantages and barriers for both traffickers and sex buyers. It requires technical expertise from the traffickers to post the adverts and from sex buyers to locate and access the adverts. Advertising on the dark web would substantially restrict the customer base that traffickers could access via the adverts, as well as making it harder to advertise victims in the first place. A similar myth is that outlawing paying for sex would just drive prostitution underground, making it harder to identify victims and perpetrators and having no impact on the scale of offending. There's a logical fallacy underlying this claim. Men who pay for sex have to be able to locate women to sexually exploit. Police officers and support services can look at exactly the same adverts that sex buyers do to locate victims and perpetrators. In short, if sex buyers can find the women being exploited, so can the police. Finally, perhaps the most destructive myth of all is being paid to perform sex acts is work, making the men who pay women for sex ordinary consumers. We need to be absolutely clear as policymakers, as a parliament, that there is no such thing as sex work. Giving someone money or accommodation or food or other goods and services in exchange for a sex act is sexual exploitation and abuse, and it is never acceptable, and our laws must reflect that. Madam Chair, I want to thank the Honourable and Right Honourable members for making their time to attend the debate today, and I hope that together we can start to end this exploitation of women. I want to conclude with the words of Maya Duvicha, a survivor of prostitution, who said of described demand reduction legislation that criminalises sex buyers and decriminalises victims like this. Why this law works is because it puts them, sex buyers, at risk of bringing what they do in the dark into who they are in the day. Thank you.